If you spend any time in Australia today, you'll quickly notice a distinct cultural rhythm. There is a deep ingrained belief in the fair go, a fierce egalitarianism, a stubborn loyalty to your mates, and an almost reflexive urge to cheer for the underdog. But that laid-back, anti-authoritarian mindset clashes violently with the reality of how the nation was actually built. Australia was born as a rigid, uncompromising British penal colony. British magistrates strictly enforced class divides, and the slightest infraction by a convict or a poor settler was met with the lash. The colonial law was applied exclusively downward, heavy and brutal. When the state uses violence indiscriminately against its lowest classes, it creates a justice vacuum. The law completely loses its moral authority. The public begins to view the courts and the police as pure oppressors rather than protectors. For those trapped at the bottom of this hierarchy, the system offered zero legal avenues for relief. If obeying the law guaranteed starvation or endless flogging, breaking the law became the only logical strategy for basic survival. This desperate need to escape birthed the first generation of bushrangers. These men fled into the harsh, unfamiliar outback, turning the very landscape the British feared into a natural fortress against colonial rule. Take Jack Donahue. He arrived in Sydney as a convict in 1825, slipped out of his chains, and quickly organized a gang. He transitioned from a fleeing prisoner to a methodical highwayman, directly targeting the carriages and supplies of wealthy British elites. To the British authorities, Donahue was a terror. To the thousands of indentured servants and poor settlers, he was striking back at the exact magistrates who kept them impoverished. They willingly protected him, fed his crew, and wrote ballads about his exploits. By treating the wealthy as targets and the poor as allies, Donahue wrote the rulebook for a distinctly Australian archetype, the outlaw operating as a populist champion. In the 1850s, the discovery of gold threw gasoline on this simmering social fire. Empty dust bowls erupted into bustling settlements seemingly overnight, flooding the isolated colony with sudden, staggering wealth. That wealth entirely bypassed the working class. Corrupt gold commissioners levied heavy, inescapable taxes on the prospectors. This system enriched the banks and the colonial government, while leaving the actual miners broke, exhausted, and bitter. For the bushranger, the objective evolved. The days of stealing sheep to survive were over. They launched heavily armed raids directly on gold escorts and banks, specifically targeting the state's massive financial infrastructure. The gold rush took a localized rebellion and scaled it up. In a society fractured by extreme wealth inequality, the bushranger operated as a highly visible, violent equalizer. This escalation peaked in the late 1870s with Ned Kelly. He forged local plowshares into 92 pounds of bulletproof iron armor. Petty theft was entirely replaced by outright war. When Kelly's gang took over a town like Geraldary, they bypassed the petty cash. They actively sought out the bank's mortgage documents, the ledgers keeping local farmers in crippling debt, and set them on fire. By reducing those records to ash, Kelly single-handedly wiped out the financial liabilities of dozens of families. He delivered tangible, immediate relief to the poorest settlers, securing the absolute loyalty of the rural underclass. The colonial government responded with overwhelming military force. In a final standoff at Glenrowan, Kelly and his men faced down heavily armed police, absorbing dozens of bullets into their homemade iron suits before eventually falling. By the time he was captured, Kelly had redefined the outlaw's purpose. He pushed the bushranger from a symbol of quiet survival into a heavily armed force capable of bringing institutional power to a grinding halt. The state, with its endless resources, always won the physical battle. Donahue was shot dead in the bush. Kelly was tried, convicted, and hanged in Melbourne at age 25. The individuals were systematically eliminated. This graph tracks the paradox of their defeat. You see these tiny, abrupt lines at the bottom? Those are the short physical lifespans of the outlaws. Now watch this massive vertical curve erupting after their deaths. The hangman's noose guaranteed their martyrdom, accelerating their transition from mortal criminals into immortal legends. This young, isolated nation urgently required a story of its own. The people were done inheriting tales of British kings from half a world away. They needed myths built directly from the red dirt they stood on. The physical deaths of the bushrangers were entirely irrelevant to their impact. Ideologically, they won. They successfully stripped away the unquestioned reverence for the British Crown and replaced it with a homegrown respect for defiance. You can draw a direct historical line from the soot of those burned mortgage documents to the modern Australian spirit. The deep-seated skepticism of politicians, the mockery of anyone taking themselves too seriously, the outright refusal to bow to rigid authority, it all traces straight back to the bush. Most nations build their monuments to the generals and the lawmakers. Australia built its identity around the men who shot at them. When the law is historically recognized as a tool for punishment, breaking the law becomes the highest form of solidarity. The bushrangers serve as the cultural DNA of Australia. Long after the colonial prisons crumbled and the gold dried up, they left behind a permanent blueprint for the national character, a rugged, unbreakable loyalty to the underdog.